The morning after I gave my son my house, I found out I no longer had a home. I turned 72 on a mild Tuesday in early April, and by 10 o'clock that morning I had already signed the deed at a law office in downtown Columbus, Ohio, with a hand that trembled more from sentiment than age. Michael sat beside me in his pressed blue shirt, smiling that careful smile children wear when they want to look grateful enough for the room. Claire sat across from us with her leather planner, her neat brown hair tucked behind one ear, looking more like she was closing a business deal than celebrating a family milestone. But I told myself not to think that way. I told myself that love can look practical when people are busy. I told myself that a son who works long hours and a daughter-in-law who runs her life by calendar alerts might not sound warm, but they could still mean well. So I signed. I signed because the house had been in my name for 41 years. I signed because Michael had said it would make everything simpler later. I signed because he called me Mom in that soft voice he used when he was little and wanted me to believe him. Afterward, I bought lunch for all three of us at a little diner with cracked red booths and bottomless coffee. I even let the waitress stick a candle in my pie. Michael kissed my cheek. Claire said, "This is a big step for the family." And for a few hours, I believed I had done something wise. That night, I washed the good plates, folded the birthday cards, and placed the extra lemon pie in the refrigerator. No one stayed long. No one asked if I felt strange about signing over the place where I had raised my child, buried my husband in memory, and measured my whole adult life by the marks on a kitchen doorway. By 8:30 the house was quiet again. I remember standing in the hallway with my hand on the wall, feeling the old paint cool under my palm, thinking that walls remember things better than people do. The next morning, I went to 7 o'clock service at church, then stopped by the grocery store for half and half, wheat bread, and the brand of strawberry jam Michael liked when he visited. I still thought like a mother then. I still bought for someone who had already made plans without me. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Michael's SUV wasn't there, but Claire's silver sedan was. That felt odd. So did the way the front curtains were closed in the middle of the day. I carried my grocery bag to the porch, set it down, and slipped my key into the lock. It did not turn. I tried again, slower this time. Then once more. The metal scraped, stubborn and unfamiliar. My own front door had gone strange in my hand. I stood there for a full minute before I knocked. No answer. I looked through the narrow pane of glass beside the entry and saw 3 cardboard boxes stacked in the foyer. One had my winter sweaters in it. Another held the framed photograph from my 40th anniversary. The third had the blue ceramic lamp from Harold's side of the bed. That was when my phone buzzed. It was Michael. Just one message. "Mom, this is for the best. Claire thinks some space would help everyone adjust." I read it twice. Then a third time, as if the meaning might soften if I gave it another chance. It did not. Through the glass, I saw Claire cross the hallway in a cream blouse and pencil skirt, phone in one hand, coffee mug in the other, calm as a woman already living in a future she had picked out for herself. She glanced toward the door, saw me standing there, and kept walking. I did not pound on the wood. I did not scream. I did not call the neighbors over to witness my humiliation. I picked up the grocery bag, walked back to my Buick, and set it gently in the passenger seat. The jam had tipped over on its side. In that moment, something inside me settled, not with peace, but with clarity. My son thought he had moved me out with one text and a locksmith. Claire thought she had erased me before lunch. But they had both made one mistake. They assumed a 72-year-old woman with silver hair, sensible shoes, and a quiet voice had nothing left but hurt. They were wrong. I drove 3 blocks before I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so hard that my fingers had gone pale. I pulled into the parking lot of a pharmacy, turned off the engine, and just sat there with the grocery bag beside me like I was waiting for someone to explain a misunderstanding that no longer existed. The half and half had started to sweat inside the plastic. The bread was crushed at one corner. A jar of strawberry jam had rolled against the door, tapping softly each time I shifted in my seat. It was such an ordinary little sound. That was the part that nearly undid me. Betrayal does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes with groceries in the passenger seat and a message written as if you are a problem being managed. I called Michael. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I waited a full minute and called again. This time he picked up, but he did not sound frightened or rushed or ashamed. He sounded tired, like I had interrupted a meeting. I asked him one question. I said, "Michael, where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" There was a pause on the other end so long I could hear office sounds behind him, a copier, a chair moving, someone laughing too far away to care. Then he said he thought I might stay with a friend for a few days while everybody adjusted. Everybody. That was the word he chose, as if I had been included in a decision made without me. I asked him if he knew the locks had been changed before I came home. Another pause. Then he said Claire had handled the details because she was better at logistics. Better at logistics. I repeated the phrase after we hung up, not because I found it clever, but because I wanted to hear how cold it sounded in the open air. I did not cry. I started the car and drove to the diner from the day before, the one with the red booths and coffee that never seemed to cool. I took the corner booth by the window and ordered hot tea because my hands needed something to hold. The waitress from my birthday shift recognized me. She smiled and asked if I was still celebrating. I smiled back and said not exactly. She did not press. There is a kindness in this country that lives in people who know when not to ask another question. I took out my phone and read the message again. Then I noticed another one had come in, not from Michael, but from Claire. It said, "We packed a few essentials. We can arrange a time later for the rest. Please do not come by unannounced." I stared at that sentence until the tea went cold. Unannounced. In my own home. I should tell you something about Claire. She never raised her voice. She never had to. She had a way of making control sound like courtesy. She called rules boundaries and exclusion privacy. She could turn a closed door into a reasonable request if she said it with the right smile. And Michael had spent so many years standing beside that smile that he had forgotten how to hear the steel underneath it. I opened my email, not because I expected comfort there, but because I needed facts. I have always trusted facts more than feelings when the ground starts to move. There was a receipt from a local locksmith time-stamped at 8:14 the night before, sent automatically, because years ago I had put all house-related service emails under my account. There was also a notification from the home security app saying a new entry code had been created at 8:27 p.m. I looked at those 2 times and felt something in me go very still. They had not panicked this morning and changed the locks after some argument. They had done it last night, after birthday pie, after Michael kissed my cheek, after Claire called it a big step for the family. They had sat in my kitchen, waited for me to clear the plates, and planned the hour I would stop belonging there. I reached into my purse for a pen and wrote the times on a paper napkin. Then I wrote Claire handled the details. Then I wrote do not come by unannounced. I folded that napkin and slid it into my wallet like it was the first page of a new life I had never wanted but was going to read carefully anyway. When I finally stood to leave, I knew 2 things with perfect certainty. This had been arranged before I ever came home from church, and whatever happened next, I was not going to let them tell the story of that house without me. After I left the diner, I drove to the public library on East Broad Street because it was the one place in Columbus where I had always been able to think without feeling watched. I parked under a young maple tree, turned off the engine, and sat with my hands folded in my lap while the afternoon light slid across the dashboard. I kept seeing those 3 boxes in the foyer, not because they held anything especially valuable, but because of how neatly they had been stacked, as if I had already been measured, sorted, and reduced to items that could be moved before lunch. That kind of cruelty does not begin in a single day. It takes practice. It takes rehearsal. And once I let myself admit that, other moments began rising to the surface, one after another, small enough on their own to excuse, but together forming a pattern too clean to ignore. The first one I thought of was Thanksgiving 2 years earlier. Michael had told me dinner would be at 3. I baked pecan pie, made the cranberry relish the way Harold liked it, and wore the rust-colored sweater my granddaughter once said made me look elegant. I arrived at 3:10 and found them already clearing plates. Claire smiled and said, "Oh, did Michael not tell you we moved it up?" Michael kissed my cheek and said the kids were getting restless, as if children had invented time itself and the rest of us simply had to surrender. I stood there holding my pie dish, pretending not to notice that every place at the table had been set except one. Then there was Lauren's spring piano recital. Michael told me it was on a Saturday at 4. I showed up early, sat in the second row, and waited through 40 minutes of other families greeting one another with flowers and cameras. When the recital began, Lauren was nowhere in the program. I checked my phone and found a message from Claire sent 2 hours before. Wrong date, she had written. It was yesterday. No apology. Just a smiling face at the end. as if that could soften the sting of an empty auditorium and a grandmother sitting alone with a purse full of peppermints she would never get to hand over. I remember going back to my car that day and telling myself people make mistakes. I had said it so often by then it sounded almost like prayer. There were smaller things too, the kind that leave no bruise but still teach you your place. Family photos posted online where everyone was tagged except me. Weekend trips I only learned about because the children mentioned them by accident. Dinners canceled at the last minute because Claire said the week had been hectic, followed by pictures of the four of them at a steakhouse the very same night. Once, when I stopped by with tomato soup after Michael had the flu, Claire met me on the porch and said they were trying to rest, but later I saw through the den window that her sister was inside drinking coffee at my kitchen table. My kitchen table then, anyway. I had noticed each slight at the time, but I wrapped every one of them in excuses and set them on a shelf because mothers are taught that forgiveness is nobler than recognition. We are praised for being understanding even when understanding becomes another word for disappearing. Sitting in that parked car outside the library, I thought about all the times Claire had spoken about boundaries, efficiency, transitions, and what was practical for this season of life. She always used words that sounded modern and sensible, the kind that made resistance seem old-fashioned. And Michael, who once could not sleep through a thunderstorm unless I sat on the edge of his bed, had slowly learned to translate her distance into maturity. He had begun correcting me in her language. He no longer said, "Mom, do not worry." He said, "Mom, do not make this harder than it needs to be." That was his new voice. Smooth, managed, trimmed down so that anything tender in it had no room to breathe. By the time I stepped out of the car and walked toward the library doors, I understood something I had not been willing to name before. They had not suddenly decided I was inconvenient. They had been preparing me for removal in careful little lessons, each one designed to make me accept less, speak less, expect less. The locked door had not been the beginning. It was simply the first time they had stopped pretending. Inside the library, I took a seat at a small oak table near the biography shelves and opened a yellow legal pad from my purse, the one I usually used for church committee notes and grocery lists. That afternoon it became something else. I wrote Claire at the top of the page, then stared at her name long enough to feel almost embarrassed by it. For years I had avoided putting anything in writing because writing makes a thing harder to deny. If I wrote it down, then I would have to admit I had seen it. And I had seen more than I let myself say. Claire was never careless. That was what made her dangerous. Careless people leave messes. Claire left explanations. She could remove you from a room and make it sound like she was protecting your comfort. She could exclude you from a decision and call it reducing your stress. She had a way of speaking that polished every insult until it reflected your own face back at you. I remembered the first time I truly noticed it. It was at Lauren's 8th birthday party, in my backyard, under white string lights I had paid to replace because Claire said the old ones looked tired in photographs. I was carrying out lemonade when I heard Claire laughing with two of her friends near the patio. She did not know I was behind the screen door. One woman asked whether it was hard living so close to family. Claire took a sip of iced tea and said, "It has its challenges. Evelyn means well, but she still thinks this is her house, and we are just visiting." The women laughed softly, the way women do when they want to pretend they are being kind. Then Claire added, "I keep telling Michael we need firmer boundaries, or we will never be able to build our own life." I stood there with a pitcher in my hand, listening to my own name turned into a management problem at a party I had hosted, under lights I had replaced, for a child whose birthday cake I had baked from scratch. When I stepped outside, Claire smiled at me as if she had not just folded me into a complaint. That was her gift. She never looked guilty because she never saw herself as cruel. She saw herself as efficient. Later, the signs multiplied. She began rearranging drawers in my kitchen whenever she stayed over, not enough to call it rude, just enough to make me feel clumsy in my own routines. She once suggested I move my late husband's photo from the living room mantel to the hallway because, in her words, the room needed a cleaner visual line. Another time she told me that older homes could feel emotionally crowded, and maybe that was why I had trouble letting go. She said it while standing in the entryway with her car keys and a smile, as if diagnosing me was an act of care. Michael absorbed her language slowly, like rain sinking into soil. At first he would defend me. Then he would explain her. Then, without either of us noticing the exact moment it happened, he began repeating her. He told me I was too attached to objects. He told me I took things personally. He told me change was not rejection. Those sentences did not sound like my son. They sounded rehearsed, sharpened, improved for delivery. What struck me now was how often Claire had prepared the ground before every humiliation. If family dinner started earlier than I had been told, she would mention later that communication had been chaotic that week. If I was left out of a school event, she would say the schedule kept shifting. If I offered help and was turned away, she would thank me for understanding before I had agreed to understand anything at all. She built little verbal bridges over every wound so no one had to look down and see the drop. Sitting there in the hush of the library, with pages turning somewhere behind me and afternoon sun slipping across the carpet, I finally stopped asking whether Claire disliked me. Dislike was too simple. Claire did not want my affection. She wanted my position. She wanted the authority of the home, the center seat at holidays, the final word on what family meant, and most of all, she wanted it uncontested. The locks had not changed because of one argument or one bad morning. They changed because, in Claire's mind, the transition had already happened long ago. She had just been patient enough to wait until everyone else was ready to call it reasonable. By the time I left the library, the sun had shifted west, and the city had that late afternoon look I have always loved. Warm light on brick buildings, long shadows across the sidewalks, people carrying coffee cups and grocery bags as if the world were still arranged in ordinary ways. I drove without hurry, not because I had somewhere to go, but because I needed a little longer before deciding what kind of woman I was going to be after that day. At a red light near Bexley, I looked at the empty passenger seat and suddenly thought of Michael at 6 years old, sitting there with a paper crown from Burger King sliding over one eyebrow, asking if we could take the long way home so he could finish telling me about a frog he had found at recess. He used to tell me everything. That is the part people do not understand when they talk about betrayal, like it begins with property or money. It begins much earlier, in the slow thinning of a voice that once came to you first. When Michael was little, he would run to the kitchen the minute I came back from the store and look through the bags as if every loaf of bread and box of cereal had been selected just for him. When he was 13 and got cut from junior varsity baseball, he sat on the back steps with his head down and let me say nothing for nearly 20 minutes, because even then he knew comfort does not always sound like advice. When he was 21 and called me from his apartment after his first real heartbreak, I stayed on the phone until after midnight listening to him breathe through the silence. That boy had once needed me the way people need home, not every second, not loudly, but with complete trust that it would still be there when they turned the corner. Somewhere along the years, that trust changed shape. I noticed it in pieces, never all at once. He stopped calling to talk and started calling to update. He no longer asked, "What do you think, Mom?" He asked, "Can you drop this off? Can you watch the kids? Can you sign this? Can you understand?" Understanding became my assigned role. I was expected to offer it before anyone offered honesty. I remember one Christmas Eve when the children were still young. The power went out for an hour during a snowstorm, and everyone gathered in my living room with blankets and candles. Michael sat on the floor by my feet, laughing while I heated soup on the gas stove, and Claire kept checking her phone for the utility updates. At one point he looked up at me and said, "I swear, Mom, no matter where life takes us, this house will always be the center of things." I had believed him, not because I was foolish, but because mothers store those sentences in the softest part of themselves. We treat them as promises even when the people who speak them grow into strangers. In recent years, the distance had become harder to ignore. Michael had started speaking to me as if everything needed managing. Even his kindness came scheduled. He would call on Sunday evenings while driving home from soccer practice with the children in the back, and the whole conversation would feel like a checkbox he was trying to complete before dinner. Claire would be in the background now and then, reminding him about a reservation or a grocery pickup, and I could hear how quickly my place in his mind had narrowed. I was no longer the person he leaned toward. I was the person he fit in. Sitting there at another red light with my turn signal clicking into the empty air, I finally let myself feel the real loss. It was not only that he had taken the house. It was that he had already taken his heart somewhere I could no longer reach it. A son does not wake up one morning and forget who stayed up through his fevers, who packed his lunches, who worked extra hours after his father died, so he could still go on the 8th grade field trip to Washington, D.C. Forgetting like that is not sudden. It is practiced. It is made easier each time someone teaches him that gratitude is childish and independence means cutting loose the hands that raised him. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of the Hampton Inn near the airport and booked myself a room for the night, I understood something painful but clean. I had not lost Michael in one message or one changed lock. I had been losing him by degrees for years, and now that the last veil had dropped, I was done begging memory to do the work that character refused to do. The hotel room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and machine-made air, the kind of room meant for travelers with rolling suitcases and early flights, not for a woman. Sitting on the edge of a bed, trying to understand how her own life had been moved outside of itself. I placed my purse on the desk, lined up my car keys beside the television remote, and set the yellow legal pad in front of me as if order on a laminate surface could somehow restore order in my mind. For a long time I did nothing. I listened to the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional slam of a door down the hall. Then, at a little after 7, my phone rang. Michael. I let it ring once more before answering, not to punish him, but to steady my voice. When I said hello, he exhaled in a way that told me he had expected tears and was surprised not to hear them. He asked where I was. Not are you all right? Not Mom, I am sorry. Just where I was. As though my location mattered more than the fact that I had been locked out of the place where I had slept for 4 decades. I told him I was safe. Then I waited. Silence can be useful when someone is trying to decide which version of themselves to offer you. He chose the polished one. He said the day had gotten more emotional than anyone expected. He said Claire was overwhelmed. He said the children had been confused. He said they all needed a little time and a little space so things could settle into a healthier arrangement. A healthier arrangement. I sat there in that hotel chair with my hand resting on the legal pad and thought about how often unkind people borrow the language of wellness when they are doing something ruthless. I asked him a simple question. I said, Michael, when exactly did you decide I would not be sleeping in my own bed last night? He was quiet long enough for me to hear him shift the phone from one hand to the other. Then he said it was not like that. People say that when it is exactly like that. I asked him whether he knew the locks had been changed before I came home from church. He answered too fast the first time, saying Claire had arranged some things because emotions were high. Then he slowed down and said he had known it might happen, but only temporarily. Only until everybody calmed down. Everybody again. That word was beginning to feel like a closed gate painted to look friendly. I asked him if he had watched me serve pie the night before knowing I would be standing on the porch the next day with a key that no longer worked. He did not answer that. Instead, he said he had been trying to avoid a scene. That was when something in me turned clean and hard. A scene. As if the problem was not what he had done, but the inconvenience of my reaction to it. I told him there had been no scene. I had not shouted. I had not begged. I had not even knocked twice. I said the only scene in this story was a son letting his mother discover her removal with a grocery bag in her hand. He tried to recover himself then. He said I was making this more dramatic than it needed to be. He said Claire had been under pressure and that I had to try to see how tense things had become in the house. I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so thin. Tense for whom? I asked him if my sweaters and cardboard boxes by the foyer were also part of reducing tension. I asked if the message telling me not to come by unannounced had been his wording or Claire's. He did not like that question. His tone changed. It dropped half a degree and became something I had only heard in business calls and customer service lines. He said Claire was his wife and that I needed to respect that. There it was. Not confusion. Not weakness. Choice. Clear, adult, fully dressed choice. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the beige hotel curtains glowing under the parking lot lights. Then I said the quietest thing I had said all day. I said, I do respect your wife, Michael. What I do not respect is cowardice dressed up as practicality. He inhaled sharply. I do not know whether it was anger or shame, and by then I no longer cared. He started to say my name, but I cut him off. I asked one final question. I said, did you ever plan to tell me face to face, or were you always going to let a lock in a text do your speaking for you? He had no answer for that either. When the call ended, I did not feel relief. Relief would have meant I still expected something better from him. What I felt instead was certainty. All day I had been trying to decide whether my son had been led, persuaded, cornered, or confused. Now I knew. Claire may have arranged the details, but Michael had supplied the permission. And once a man gives someone else permission to make his mother small, He is no longer standing in the middle. He has already chosen his side. After I hung up, I sat so still that the room itself seemed to move around me. The air conditioner clicked on. A car door slammed somewhere below in the parking lot. I shifted in the machine down the hall. Ordinary sounds. That was what struck me most. The world had not cracked open just because mine had. People were checking in, ordering takeout, watching cable news, folding tomorrow's clothes over the backs of hotel chairs. And in the middle of all that ordinary life, I realized I had crossed some quiet line inside myself. All day I had been reacting as a mother. Hurt mother. Confused mother. Humiliated mother. But now, for the first time since I stood on that porch with my groceries, I was not looking at Michael and Claire through the eyes of love. I was looking at them through the eyes of fact. The difference was almost physical. It felt like setting down a bag I had carried so long I no longer noticed the weight. I pulled the legal pad closer and wrote a single sentence at the top of the next page. This was not emotional. This was strategic. I looked at those words for a long moment. Then I wrote another. They did not want distance. They wanted control. Once I saw that clearly, everything else rearranged itself around it. The boxes in the foyer were not impulsive. The changed locks were not temporary. The polite wording of the texts was not an attempt to keep peace. It was all designed to do one thing. Remove me from the center of the house, without having to face me as the woman who built it. That was what made it so cold. They did not even want the discomfort of witnessing the damage. They wanted the outcome without the shame. I stood up and walked to the window. The view was a parking lot, a row of sodium lights, a vending machine glowing near the lobby entrance. Nothing beautiful, nothing dramatic. But in that dull reflection on the glass, I saw myself more honestly than I had all day. Silver hair slightly out of place, blush long faded, pearl earrings still on from my birthday lunch. A woman who had spent years making herself gentle so other people could remain comfortable. I thought about how often women of my generation are taught that dignity means endurance, that grace means silence, that the higher road is always the one where you swallow your own anger before it inconveniences anyone else. There is some truth in that, but there is also a trap. If you are not careful, people will use your decency as the floor they wipe their shoes on. I was done with that. Not done with being decent. Done with mistaking decency for surrender. I went back to the desk, opened my purse, and took out every paper I had with me. The copy of the signed documents from the law office. My church bulletin from that morning. The grocery receipt time-stamped at 7:42. The napkin from the diner with the locksmith time written on it. Claire's message. Michael's message. I laid them out in a row, each one a small, plain witness. For the first time all day, I did not ask myself how this could have happened. I asked what it proved. That question changed everything. It moved me out of grief and into structure. I was no longer trying to rescue an image of my son that facts could not support. I was no longer searching for the kindest interpretation. Kindness had carried me this far, and this far was a hotel room 20 minutes from my own bed. I picked up the hotel pen and began making a timeline. Lunch after signing. They leave. Lock changed. Entry code updated. Church. Grocery store. Porch. Text. Call. Second text. Diner. Locksmith receipt. Security notification. Every event clicked into place like teeth in a zipper. The pattern was too neat to be explained away. By the time I finished, the woman who had checked into that room was gone. In her place was someone steadier, quieter, and much more dangerous to people who mistook softness for weakness. I was still wounded. I was still tired. I was still 72 years old and sleeping in a hotel because my own son had let someone turn my home into a border I was expected not to cross. But underneath all of that, something harder had taken root. They believed they had pushed me into confusion. What they had actually pushed me into was clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, does not go back to sleep. That night, I did not sleep much. I lay on top of the hotel comforter in my blouse and slacks, staring at the ceiling while headlights moved in thin bands across the wall, and sometime around 4 a.m, I understood that grief was no longer the most useful thing I had. Information was. By 6:30 I was dressed again, hair brushed, lipstick fresh, legal pad in my bag, and coffee in my hand from the lobby machine that tasted faintly burnt and overly sweet. I drove back across town just after sunrise, not to confront anyone, but to look. Morning has a way of exposing what people forget to hide. I parked half a block from my house on the opposite side of the street. under a sycamore tree whose bark always peeled in thin white strips in spring. From there I could see the front walk, the driveway, and most of the side yard without being noticed unless someone was looking for me. At 7:12, Claire came out in a cream trench coat with her phone pressed to her ear and a travel mug in her hand. She paused long enough to tap a code into the front lock, then got into her sedan and drove away. I wrote down the time. More important, I wrote down that there was no sign of panic in her movements. No overnight crisis. No frightened family trying to keep peace. Just a woman leaving for work from a house she had already decided belonged to her. At 7:40, a landscaping truck pulled up and two men unloaded fresh mulch by the front flower beds. I knew I had never ordered that service. Claire had. Even in the middle of forcing me out, she had found time to improve curb appeal. I wrote that down too, not because mulch mattered, but because confidence does. People who think they might be doing something wrong do not schedule cosmetic upgrades the next morning. Around 8:30, my neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, stepped out to get her newspaper. She was 78, sharp-eyed, and far too observant to miss a thing on our street. I waited until she glanced my way, then got out of the car and walked over. She looked at me, then at my house, then back at me again. She did not ask any foolish questions. She simply said, "I saw the locksmith last night." That sentence landed with more weight than she probably knew. I asked what time. She said a little after 8, maybe 8:15, because Wheel of Fortune had just ended and she was watering the fern on her porch. She also told me Michael had been there, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, while Claire spoke to the locksmith and pointed at the deadbolt. Not confusion. Not a misunderstanding. Participation. I thanked her and asked one more thing, whether her porch camera faced enough of my driveway to catch the truck and the timing. She said it did. Then she put her hand over mine for one quiet second and said, "Evelyn, do not let them make you feel unreasonable." I carried that sentence back to my car like something warm. From there I drove to the bank where I kept my safety deposit box and retrieved copies of older property tax records, insurance papers, and the handwritten note Harold had left years earlier about how carefully we wanted everything structured after his death. Then I sat in the parking lot and called the home security company. A young man named Trevor confirmed that the new access code had been entered from inside the house at 8:27 the previous evening and that my administrator permissions on the account had been reduced at 8:31. Reduced. Not removed by accident. Reduced by someone who wanted me cut off slowly enough for it to seem technical. I asked him to email me the activity log. He did. I saved it in 3 places before pulling out of the lot. By noon, I had a witness, a camera angle, a locksmith timeline, an access log, texts, receipts, and the first clean outline of intent. I had spent years being treated like a sentimental woman who noticed too much and proved too little. That morning changed. That. By the time I checked out of the Hampton Inn to move to a quieter place for a few days, I was no longer gathering memories. I was building a record, and records have a way of speaking more clearly than wounded hearts ever can. The quieter place I moved to was a small inn in German village with creaking floors, white curtains, and a woman at the front desk who called everyone honey without sounding false. I checked in under my own name, carried my overnight bag to a room on the 2nd floor, then sat on the edge of the bed and made the first useful phone call of my new life. Daniel Whitaker had handled Harold's estate after he died and had been the one who prepared the papers I signed on my birthday. He answered on the 2nd ring with the same steady voice I remembered from years ago, calm enough to make Panic feel slightly embarrassed for showing up. I told him I needed to see him that morning and that it was about the deed, the locks, and my son. He did not ask me to explain over the phone. He simply said, "Come in at 10, Evelyn, and bring every document you have." His office was on the 4th floor of a brick building downtown, with framed black and white courthouse prints on the walls and a receptionist who had known me long enough not to offer false cheer. Daniel closed the door behind me, listened without interrupting while I laid out the timeline, the texts, the security log, the locksmith receipt, Mrs. Donnelly's account, and every clean little fact I had collected since standing on that porch. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked one question. He said, "Did Michael or Claire tell you that you had no right to return to the house?" I said they had not used those exact words, but they had changed the locks, reduced my access, boxed my belongings, and told me not to come by unannounced. He nodded once, then pulled my file from a cabinet and opened the deed packet to the page I had barely looked at through birthday tears and maternal trust. He slid it across the desk and tapped one paragraph with his pen. "Evelyn," he said, "you did not sign away your right to live in that house. You transferred future ownership, but you retained lifetime residential rights and exclusive legal occupancy unless you voluntarily surrendered them in writing." I stared at the paragraph, reading it once, then again, feeling each word settle into me like a stone placed carefully into a foundation. He tapped another section. "This clause," he said, "also requires your written approval for any restriction of access, any exclusion, and any material change to your possession of the home during your lifetime." Then he leaned back and looked at me over his glasses. "They cannot lawfully lock you out of a residence you still have the right to occupy." For a moment I said nothing. I simply sat there in that office with the courthouse prints on the wall and the copy paper smell in the air, while the shape of the last 48 hours changed in front of me. What Michael and Claire had done was not just cold. It was reckless. Daniel went on. He reminded me that when Harold died, I had been vulnerable and overly trusting where Michael was concerned. So Daniel had built protections into any future transfer, just in case love made me sign something faster than caution would. He said he had explained that to me at the time, and I am sure he had, but people hear what they are ready to hear. On my birthday, I had heard family. Now I heard leverage. I asked him what my options were. He did not dramatize them. That was one reason I trusted him. He said we could demand immediate restored access, document unlawful exclusion, seek emergency relief if needed, and begin proceedings to challenge the transfer on grounds that would make Michael and Claire very uncomfortable in a courtroom or settlement room. Then he said the most important sentence of the day. He said, "But before we move, let us decide whether you want justice to arrive loudly or precisely." I knew at once which I preferred. Loud people give their enemies time to brace. Precise people let the truth arrive all at once. I told Daniel I did not want a phone call that would warn them, and I did not want a heated letter they could spin into victimhood. I wanted them calm. I wanted Claire arranging flowers and Michael checking email, and both of them still believing I was confused, hurt, displaced, and too old to do anything but cry in a hotel room. Daniel's mouth moved just enough to count as a smile. He said that could be arranged. We spent the next hour making copies, drafting notices, and tightening the timeline until it could hold weight. When I left his office just before noon, I did not feel triumphant. Triumph is too careless a word for what was coming. What I felt was steadier than that. I felt prepared. They had mistaken my love for blindness and my age for weakness. Now they were going to learn the difference between giving someone a house and surrendering yourself. We waited until Thursday morning. Daniel said timing mattered almost as much as evidence, because people reveal more of themselves when they believe the day belongs to them. At 9:15, a uniformed civil deputy met us at the end of my driveway, not because I needed protection from a dramatic scene, but because Daniel preferred witnesses when facts were about to become inconvenient. The sky was clear, the dogwoods along the street were beginning to bloom, and my front porch looked so ordinary it almost offended me. Claire's sedan was in the driveway. Michael's SUV was not. That told me enough. He had gone to work, leaving her to manage the house he thought was already settled. Daniel carried a slim leather folder under one arm. I carried my handbag and the house key that no longer opened anything. The deputy walked beside us with the calm expression of a man who had seen too many family disputes to waste emotion on appearances. Claire opened the door before we knocked. She must have seen us coming through the front window. She stood there in a pale green blouse, hair smooth, mouth set in that careful line she used when she wanted to look composed in front of strangers. Her eyes moved from me to Daniel to the deputy, and for one brief second I saw something real flicker there. Not guilt. Alarm. Then it was gone. She asked what this was about in a voice polished enough to pass for innocent. Daniel answered before I could. He introduced himself, stated that he represented me, and requested immediate access to the property on the grounds that I remained the lawful lifetime residential occupant. Claire blinked once, then gave a small, incredulous laugh, as if she had just heard something embarrassingly outdated. She said there must be some confusion because the house had already been transferred. Daniel opened the folder, removed a certified copy of the deed packet, and said there was no confusion at all. He stepped just enough to the side for the deputy to see the page, then read the clause aloud in the same, even voice he might have used to discuss weather. Lifetime residential rights. Exclusive legal occupancy. No restriction of access without written consent. Material interference constituting grounds for immediate legal action and potential reversal of transfer. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Claire's face did something interesting then. It did not fall apart. Women like Claire do not collapse so easily. Instead, it emptied. You could almost see her recalculating in real time, moving from certainty to probability, from probability to risk. She said Michael handled the paperwork. Daniel replied that the paperwork said exactly what it had always said. Then he added, very gently, that changing the locks, reducing my account permissions, boxing my belongings, and instructing me not to return unannounced had created a record of exclusion that a court would likely view with considerable interest. Claire gripped the edge of the door so hard the knuckles showed white. She started to say my name, not warmly, not cruelly, but strategically, the way people use your first name when they suddenly need to act like they know your heart. I did not help her. I simply stood there and looked past her shoulder into my own foyer. The boxes were still there. My winter sweaters. The ceramic lamp. The anniversary frame. Nothing looks lonelier than your own life packed by someone else. At that exact moment, Michael's SUV turned into the driveway. He saw the deputy first, then Daniel, then me. His face lost color before he even got out. He came up the walk too quickly, asking what was going on, but it was the sort of question people ask when they already understand and merely hope the answer will somehow be smaller than the truth. Daniel handed him the same page he had shown Claire and told him to read the highlighted clause. Michael read 3 lines, then looked at me with a stunned expression that would have moved me once. Not anymore. He said he had not realized. Daniel corrected him without heat. He said, Mr. Parker, whether you realized it or not, you participated in unlawfully excluding the person who still holds the right to live here. The deputy then asked, very plainly, whether they intended to restore access immediately or force the matter into formal proceedings. It was remarkable how quickly the air changed after that. Claire stopped performing calm. Michael stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. The house, which had felt like their stage for 2 full days, suddenly became what it had always been, a legal fact with walls. Michael asked if we could discuss this privately. I said no. That was the first complete sentence I had spoken on the porch. Then I held out my old key, looked at the changed lock, and said, I will be coming back into my home now, and by the time the locksmith arrived to reverse what they had done, neither of them looked like the owners of anything at all. The locksmith worked quietly under the deputy's watch while I stood in my own doorway and let the sound of metal turning speak for all the words I no longer needed to say. Michael kept shifting his weight beside the porch rail, one hand at his hip, the other running over his jaw the way he used to do when a bill came due and he had not planned for it. Claire had stepped back into the foyer, but she did not go far. She stayed close enough to listen, far enough to pretend distance. That was still her instinct, even then. Stay near the center of the damage while acting as if she had merely wandered into it. When the lock was replaced and the new key was placed in my hand, I did not rush inside. I turned it once in my palm, feeling its clean edges against my skin, and understood that some victories are not loud at all. Some are simply the return of what should never have been taken. I crossed the threshold at a normal pace. The deputy followed for a moment, just long enough to verify restored access. Daniel remained by the entry table, folder tucked beneath his arm, watching with that same courtroom calm. Michael started to speak, but I lifted one hand, and he stopped. It was not anger that silenced him. It was something worse. It was the fact that he could finally see I was no longer asking anything from him. The foyer smelled faintly of Claire's citrus cleaner and fresh mulch drifting in from outside. My boxes were still stacked where I had first seen them through the side glass. I knelt beside them, opened the top one, and lifted out my folded gray sweater, the one Harold used to say made me look like winter sunlight. Someone had packed it carelessly. One sleeve was twisted under the lamp cord. I smoothed it flat and placed it over my arm, then stood and looked directly at Claire. I told her she would not be packing another item that belonged to me. My voice did not shake. Hers did, just slightly, when she said they had only been trying to create a workable arrangement. That phrase might have angered me 2 days earlier. Now it only sounded tired. I told her arrangements require consent, and theft dressed in soft language is still theft. Michael said my name then, as if perhaps there was still some old door inside me he could open by sounding like my son again. I turned to him and saw, for the first time without sentiment getting in the way, a middle-aged man who had confused access with entitlement. I told him very plainly that from this moment forward, nothing concerning that house would be discussed casually, privately, or emotionally. It would be discussed through counsel, in writing, and under conditions I approved. Daniel stepped forward then and handed Michael a formal notice. He explained that my residential rights were being reaffirmed immediately, that any future interference would trigger legal action, and that we were reviewing the transfer itself in light of documented exclusion, coercive conduct, and material violation of the deed terms. Michael read the first page and looked physically smaller by the time he reached the second. Claire did not ask to see it. I suspect she already understood enough. I walked into the living room and saw that she had replaced the throw pillows, moved Harold's photograph from the mantel to a side shelf, and put a glass bowl of decorative moss where my brass clock had always stood. Small changes. Telling changes. The kind made by someone rehearsing ownership before it had fully arrived. I put Harold's photograph back where it belonged. Then I turned to both of them and said the next part only once. I said this house had been built on sacrifice neither of them had earned, and I would not spend the remainder of my life apologizing for existing in the place my husband and I paid for with work, grief, patience, and years they had not bothered to honor. Claire looked down first. Michael tried to say he never meant for it to go this far. I answered that it had gone exactly as far as the character of the people involved allowed it to go. That was the truth, and truth has a way of making a room unbearably quiet. Before leaving, Daniel asked whether I wished to alter my estate documents and review all beneficiary designations immediately. I said yes. Michael closed his eyes for a second when he heard that. He understood then what Claire had not. Losing the lock was only the beginning. They had not just failed to remove me. They had taught me exactly where trust no longer belonged. By the time the deputy left and Daniel gathered his papers, the power in that house had changed shape completely. Michael and Claire were still standing in the rooms they thought they had secured, but they were no longer standing in certainty. I was. The house sounded different after they left. Not louder, not quieter, just honest. I stood in the living room for a long time with Harold's photograph back on the mantel and my new key in my hand, listening to the refrigerator hum and the grandfather clock in the hallway mark each passing second, as if the walls themselves were reminding me that time had not betrayed me. Only people had. Daniel returned the next morning with revised estate papers, and I signed them at my own dining room table with sunlight falling across the wood grain Harold had polished every Christmas Eve for nearly 30 years. This time my hand did not tremble. This time I read every line. The house would not pass automatically to Michael anymore. A trust was created instead, with strict conditions, clear protections, and provisions for charitable giving to a local women's housing nonprofit and to the church literacy program I had supported for years. If Michael ever received anything in the future, it would be because he had learned that love is not a shortcut to possession. It is a responsibility. Daniel left just before noon, and when the front door closed behind him, I made myself a simple lunch, tomato soup and half a turkey sandwich, and ate it at the kitchen table in complete silence. I thought that silence might feel lonely. It did not. It felt clean. Over the next week, Michael called 3 times and sent 6 messages. Some sounded ashamed. Some sounded defensive. A few tried to do both at once. Claire sent one email that was so carefully worded it barely felt human, full of phrases about misunderstanding, emotional strain, and hoping for a path forward rooted in mutual respect. I did not answer immediately. For too many years I had treated speed as kindness, as if quick forgiveness could repair what slow selfishness had damaged. I was finished with that. When I finally responded, I wrote only what was true. I told Michael that I loved the son I raised, but I would not protect the man he had chosen to become from the consequences of his own comfort. I told Claire that respect cannot grow in a house where someone else is first erased. Then I asked for distance, and for once I did not apologize for needing it. A month later, on a Sunday afternoon washed in pale spring light, my granddaughter Lauren came by alone. She stood on the porch in jeans and sneakers, holding a grocery store bouquet of yellow daisies wrapped in crackling plastic. She was 14 then, awkward and lovely and old enough to understand when adults have cracked something that cannot be mended with a holiday meal. She handed me the flowers and said she missed me. Nothing more. Children often know better than grown people how to speak from the center of the heart. I put the daisies in Harold's blue pitcher and made us iced tea. We sat at the kitchen table where so much had begun and ended, and she told me about school, about a history test, about wanting to try out for debate team. Before she left, she looked around the room and said, "It feels like you again in here, Grandma." I carried those words with me for days. They mattered because they were not about victory. They were about presence, about truth returning to a place where it had nearly been rearranged out of sight. I wish I could tell you that Michael became the son I remembered, that Claire found humility, that our family folded itself neatly back together around one sincere apology. Life is not often so symmetrical. What I can tell you is this. I stayed. I kept the house. I kept my name on my own life. The roses bloomed again by the front walk that summer, and I trimmed them myself in the early mornings before the heat settled in. I moved Harold's chair back to its old spot by the window. I put my brass clock where it belonged. I bought a new set of keys and gave one only to the person I saw in the mirror. Some evenings I still think about that first morning, the key that would not turn, the boxes in the foyer, the message that tried to reduce a mother to an inconvenience. It no longer makes me tremble. It teaches me. Age does not make a woman easy to remove. It makes her harder to fool. By 72, I had buried a husband, paid off a mortgage, raised a son, survived loneliness, and learned how quickly affection can be confused with access. But I had also learned something else. A home is not lost the moment someone tries to push you out. It is lost only when you agree you do not belong there. I never agreed. And in the end, that made all the difference.